right. Welcome today to our Skill Up. My name's Emily Spranger, and I have had the pleasure of working in the Skill Up series for a couple of years now. I'm going to do some very brief housekeeping items for us to keep in mind, and then we'll jump in to turn it over to Dr. Bloomberg here. So, a couple of items to remember. We want you to have your questions. Please do pose them in the Q&A function of your Zoom, or you're welcome to ask questions in the chat as well. Dr. Bloomberg will pause as time permits and see if there's any questions in the chat. And then, of course, I can always come off of mute and let her know that there are some questions to address. Today, Dr. Bloomberg is going to be covering analyzing your dissertation's qualitative data, ensuring design-specific analysis. So we do realize that you might have questions about your own particular research endeavors. Do keep in mind that it is best to work with your committee and your chair on those types of questions, but we can address general questions in today's session. So keep that in mind. And just for the best flow for today's presentation, let's remain muted unless called upon. We are recording today's session, and I will post it in the YouTube channel for Skilla, and also send to all of the participants who registered today. And it has been my honor to work with Dr. Bloomberg over the last couple of years. She has provided us a wealth of resources for qualitative research and our doctoral students. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Linda Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Dr. Spranger. I really appreciate your introduction, and I greatly appreciate working with you on multiple skill ups over the last number of years. It's actually my honor and pleasure to work and develop these resources for our NU students and faculty. And so today's topic is something that I really appreciate and have delved into in many of my publications. And the topic, as we know, is analyzing your dissertation's qualitative data by way of ensuring design-specific analysis. This is a specific take on qualitative data analysis where I'm focusing on this particular area of ensuring that design-specific focus, which is extremely important and sometimes overlooked. Before we dive in, I just want to say that I will be stopping at various points along the way to take questions. But as Dr. Spranger said, please reserve your personal dissertation or research questions for your dissertation chair and committee, because we don't have enough time to address all of those individual topics and concerns in today's 1-hour session. But we will take some general questions, which I greatly appreciate at those points when I stop. And as Emily said, as Dr. Spranger said, I have to keep on remembering to call her Dr. Spranger because she recently, or not so recently, defended her excellent research. And so I just want to give her that shout out. And so I will be stopping at certain points, and she will let me know what questions have arisen in the chat as well. So that said, let's move forward to this topic of research, which everybody on the Zoom call today is involved in some shape or form in a research endeavor. And most likely, most individuals on the call are involved in dissertation research right now or heading in that direction. So whether it's an EDD or a PhD that you're pursuing, the research questions are intense. And there's a lot to learn about how do I go about research, how do I create the whole structure of the research project, how do I write the dissertation, etc. And I just want to remind us all that this was a slide that I used in a presentation some time back. And I have to give credit for it for my colleague in South Africa, Dr. Mil Werbeloff, where we look at the difference, the key difference between quantitative and qualitative research, which is that in quantitative research, we look at a much broader perspective. We take a statistical approach and we look at a very broad perspective as though we are plowing a very large field. Because remember, in quantitative research, we are working with great, huge data samples. However, in qualitative research, we are not plowing, but we're drilling down very, very, very deeply. And just sorry, I'm also going to switch off my camera so that my internet remains stable. So, in qualitative research, we are drilling down very, very specifically in order to promote a very deep understanding of a research problem from the perspective of our research participants themselves. The emphasis is on exploration, discovery, and description. The goal is to make sense of very, very large amounts of narrative information. Remember, even though we have a small sample, a purposeful sample, we do have a huge amount of information. And those people who've already gone through the dissertation data collection phase know that sometimes the amount of information you get, even from, say, 10 or 12 interviews, those transcripts, it can be overwhelming. Through the transcripts, through transcribing our interviews and our focus groups, we get what are called verbatim quotations, and these are what play a key role in grounding our studies, analysis, and findings. Remember, again, in the participants' own words, because we use their words to present our findings. The challenge lies in reducing this huge mass of information and identifying what is significant. And remember, in qualitative research, we are not talking about statistical significance as we would in quantitative research, but significance takes on a different concept in qualitative research. And there's a lot written about that. So if anybody's interested in qualitative significance, please take a look at it. It all has to do with data saturation, the richness of the themes, the depth of the coding, etc. And the researcher, who is known as the researcher as instrument, plays a primary role in determining what the findings mean. And when I say that, this alludes to interpretation. Only a researcher can interpret the findings. Not even qualitative data analysis software or AI can interpret findings. And I'm going to come back to this a little later on because this is a really important concept to understand. That even though one may use qualitative data analysis software, and some people are apt to using AI, these tools cannot replace a human in terms of interpretation. So that's all about research in a nutshell, the qualitative and the quantitative. And we're now going to move more closely into qualitative data analysis and specifically design-specific analysis. As I said a few minutes ago, qualitative data analysis is about gathering individual voices and then using these to determine what the findings of the study are. Now, an analytic approach generally in qualitative research involves coding, theme identification, evaluation of those themes, and then synthesis of the themes with the literature. And we do this to provide trustworthy interpretations. We're going to be getting to trustworthiness toward the end of this presentation because that's an important concept when it comes to qualitative data analysis. We do not look for reliability and validity as we do in quantitative research. Rather, we focus on credibility, dependability, confirmability, and transferability. But I'll be getting to that in greater detail further on. What I was saying in the beginning, in terms of our design needing, our analysis needing to be aligned with the selective qualitative research design is for the specific purpose of achieving what is known as methodological congruence. So alignment and methodological congruence are two terms that you should keep in mind at all times as you're thinking about your qualitative data analysis. Those are key core concepts to take into account along with trustworthiness. So right now we've identified three core concepts and you might want to make a mental note of it. Of course, you'll be getting a copy of this presentation after today, but just remember trustworthiness, alignment, and methodological congruence are three concepts that you're going to address in your dissertation, whether it's an EDD or a PhD. So again, just to reiterate, design-specific analysis is critical in contributing toward rigorous qualitative research. If one's analysis is not design-specific, it severely undermines the credibility and quality of the study. And that is the purpose of today's webinar, to reiterate and drive home the importance of this. So as I said, the purpose is to achieve methodological congruence, which is very closely related with the concept of alignment. Classic thematic analysis is very well suited to case study design. Qualitative content analysis is the appropriate analytic approach which is used to analyze documents, and this can take place in case study, action research, ethnography, and narrative inquiry. That is the approach one takes when one is analyzing documents, when one is using a document review as one method of data collection. Remember, another thing I just want to remind everybody about is that in a qualitative study, to achieve triangulation, that's another term to take note of, and to make sure that you address that in your dissertation. So, to achieve triangulation, you need to ensure that you have more than one data collection method. So, if you're doing interviews, that's great, but you would also need to choose one or more other methods as well in order to triangulate the findings with the findings that you get from your interviews. So some of the other ways of collecting data are focus groups, qualitative open-ended surveys or questionnaires, critical incident questionnaires, and document review. So qualitative content analysis would be the appropriate analytic approach if one is doing a document review specifically. Remember, you cannot claim to do thematic analysis with documents. And then the final one, and we're going to be getting into this in quite a bit of detail, is Interpretive Phenomenological Analysis, IPA, which is used only in a phenomenological study. We would not use this with a case study or any of the other designs mentioned above, such as action research, ethnography, or narrative inquiry. So those are the three real analytic approaches, or the three core analytic approaches that apply to qualitative research: classic thematic analysis, qualitative content analysis, remember, not regular content analysis, and I'm going to be going into the difference between those two further on, and third, interpretive phenomenological analysis, or IPA. So let's dive into thematic analysis, which is the most typically used method because most of our students do use a case study design. Case study design is very well suited to dissertation research because it's manageable, it has boundaries, whereas some of the others, like action research, is sometimes takes a lot of time. It does have to occur over an extended period of time. And so it would not always be the best suited design for dissertation research, where one is trying to complete your research in a relatively manageable amount of time, being 1 to 3 years, and not 4, 5, or 6 years, which can be an action research design. So thematic analysis involves coding, theme identification, synthesis with the literature, and then producing trustworthy interpretations. So what is coding? This word is thrown around a lot, and it's also described very differently in the literature. So I just want to make sure that I go through all the different ways that coding can be referred to. Eliot and the authors that I've cited here are some of the well-known authors in the field of qualitative research. Eliot refers to mapping or indexing data. Creswell and Bayes refer to winnowing data. Remember, the term winnowing means narrowing down. And that's exactly what coding does. Coding narrows down what you see in your interview transcripts, which can be pages and pages if you've done an hour-long interview, and can take an enormous amount of work to transcribe. And remember, all transcriptions must be done verbatim, meaning you don't change words, you don't leave anything out. You write down exactly what your participants have told you based on the recording, the audio recording that you've conducted of that interview or focus group. Miles, Huberman, and Saldana refer to data condensation. I refer to assigning an alphanumeric system of identifiers to pieces of data which are deemed significant. Creswell and Path, Lewins and Silver explain in great detail the use of qualitative data analysis software and how this can assist with organization. However, as I said earlier, the interpretive work remains with the researcher because only a researcher, a human researcher, can interpret the findings. In other words, provide the meaning behind the findings. No tool or AI or qualitative data analysis was or has as yet to this point in time been designed to substitute humanness when it comes to interpretation. And then I also talk about the advantages in my book about the combination method of including some manual data analysis combined with some computer-assisted data analysis. I do not advocate at this point the use of AI for any type of data analysis in qualitative research. That is just mine and also the point of view of many other of my colleagues and many other of the foremost researchers in the field at this point in time. So the goal or purpose of coding is to capture and catalog the core elements of the data that you see in your transcripts and to provide an overview of all the pieces of data as these relate to your study's research questions. Remember, every study, whether it's qualitative or even quantitative, where one has hypotheses, the point of data analysis is to respond to those research questions or hypotheses. So the coding process includes the analysis of specific words, word repetitions, keywords within the context. Also, the analysis of larger blocks of text, so where you compare and contrast and search for missing information. Coding requires constant comparison, which means reviewing the text and noting how sections are similar or different from each other. Then the physical manipulation of the text, which means marking the texts with colors, with specific codes, cutting and pasting, cutting and sorting. The coverage of data by codes is related to the research questions. As I said, all of the findings of the study must be presented in terms of your study's specific research questions. You can code a text segments with multiple codes, and this is something you'll discuss with your chair, is that when you do code a text segment with multiple codes, meaning more than one particular code, you have to ask yourself, what is the main idea being conveyed? Because even though a segment of text can be coded differently, you ultimately have to make sure that what you are finding is significant in terms of your research questions. Remember, the entire interview or focus group transcript must be coded. That means every single line has to be coded or every single segment has to be coded. If you have not coded certain parts, this would be a huge red flag. And the question would be, why have you not coded that? Why have you omitted it? So remember, to ensure that your research is credible, your entire transcript must be coded. Now, that does not mean that you're going to code every single word, but you're going to code every sentence and every segment or every phrase. And that is what coding involves. So it is a pretty intensive, labor-intensive process. But again, by doing it manually or by doing it manually with some help of qualitative analysis software like NVivo or Atlas, ensures that you have coverage of the entire transcript. I just want to make sure that I also mention that there is a preference among many researchers to use only the manual approach and not any qualitative analysis software, and that's fine. I've done a lot of my own research that way. One of the advantages of doing it completely manually means that you, as a human researcher, is very, very close to your data and really allows you a very, very close reading of what your findings mean. I find it very, very helpful to do a manual approach, and I'm not saying that a combination is not good as well, but that manual portion really gives you that very close working relationship with your data so that you're extremely familiar with what each and every one of your participants has told you. The coding techniques for thematic analysis are twofold. We can have an inductive approach, which is a bottom-up approach where you build patterns and themes from the bottom up, and the themes are grounded in the data itself. And one can also take a deductive approach, which is a top-down approach, where you review the data according to your theoretical or conceptual framework to determine if the data can support each theme or whether additional information is needed through further coding. Remember, because qualitative research is flexible and iterative, you would likely go through many rounds of coding. And that's why most of my students develop many different coding schemes. The first coding scheme that you develop is not always the one that you land up with. Very often you do another round of coding, and this brings up new codes as well. And I always recommend with all of my students, and they've all done this to date, is that in the appendix of their dissertation, they include all the different iterations of their coding schemes. Sometimes there are 2, sometimes there are 3 or 4. But it's really, really important to include all those iterations so that a reader or an examiner can see how you developed your coding scheme over time. Now, once you've got your codes, you have to create groups of categories, which then become your themes. Categories are really another word for themes. So your coded transcript quotations are sorted and organized, again, by your research questions to identify themes, and each research question has its own associated themes. In addition to the themes that are clearly explicit, this is a really important point. Researchers also search for themes that are missing or absent. So, in other words, what is not said is actually as important as what is said. So sometimes if there's a glaring omission or people are not talking about something, that is something to delve into and try and work out why that is not being mentioned or spoken about as much as other things. Because much can be learned from the text by what is not spoken about, which become your implicit or unspoken themes. And most studies do have implicit or unspoken themes. So when you discuss all of your themes, both the explicit and the implicit, this creates a vivid picture that tells the story of your overall study. And that is what your findings chapter is all about. Sorry, data saturation. So how do you know when you've found all the themes? There's no magic formula in qualitative data analysis. In quantitative analysis, which is different, there are formulas to develop saturation, but not so in qualitative analysis. Saturation is basically the point at which no new information or themes are being observed. It's an important concept because it provides an indication of trustworthiness, and it's also used to assess the quality of the research. When and how saturation is reached depends on the number of texts and their complexity. And a researcher must be acutely aware of premature closure, where they fail to move beyond the face value of the text. This is something I talk about in most of my publications on qualitative data analysis, because premature closure really limits the study and limits the rigor of the study. So be sure not to shut down or end your data analysis prematurely, because this can preclude you from finding all of the themes, including those implicit or hidden themes. Again, this is something you would work on very, very closely with your dissertation chair, who would help guide you toward achieving saturation. And again, just to be very clear, this is not statistical saturation. It is saturation in terms of all the themes being discovered and no new information emerging. So let's look at the strengths and limitations of thematic analysis. The strengths are that it's a flexible approach, that it's accessible for beginning researchers, because it is something that can be learned and something that can be perfected. Again, with the help of your dissertation chair. It works with many different data types and sample sizes, and you can also be very creative because just think about this. If two researchers or student researchers are given a particular transcript, it would be highly unlikely that that transcript will be coded exactly the same by both researchers. There would be differences. Of course, there'd be some similarities, but there would also be differences. And this is because the creative part of the human brain sees things differently. And so one of the wonderful things about thematic analysis is that you do have the opportunity to be creative and to bring in your creative side in terms of looking at your transcripts and coding them. The limitations of thematic analysis is that it can become very superficial if it's poorly applied. So in other words, if not sufficient time is devoted to the analysis or it's not given thoughtful attention, this could become a huge red flag and really limit the credibility of the study. Another limitation is that individual voices can get lost because you are reporting on, even though it's a small sample, say 10 to 15 people, you want to make sure that all the individual voices are highlighted. And sometimes a researcher can tend to focus more on some participants than others. And so individual voices can get lost. And this is a cautionary point that one needs to be very, very well aware of. And hopefully the dissertation chair will also pick that up if that is occurring. Remember again, even though it's doable and this technique can be learned, rigorous analysis also depends on the researcher's skills and expertise. And we see in dissertations and in any research projects that some data is coded more professionally or more comprehensively than others. So again, the researcher skills and expertise is something that needs to be developed and really focused on so that you are sure that your qualitative data analysis is of the highest quality that you can produce. Now, before we go to the next way of doing qualitative data analysis, which is qualitative content analysis, I'm going to stop and ask Emily if any questions have come up.
Yes, actually, there was a couple of questions in the Q&A, so I was hoping that we could discuss them now, but it does have to do with utilizing focus group interviews. So I'm not quite sure if you're going to be covering that, but that's what it's about.
Can you just read the question and I'll see if it's something we can address now or wait till later?
Absolutely, yes. So the question is, when you're doing the qualitative research, utilizing a focus group interviews, how many interviews should be used, or is there not a limit?
Well, this comes back to sample size, and it's really about methodology, which we're not going to be covering
Cover
in
today.
this. I think it's a good question, but it's a little bit at a tangent to what we're discussing here. But there are recommendations for sample size in qualitative research. There also what's important is that each research design has different parameters. So if you're doing a case study, you'd be having more people than you would in a phenomenological study, for instance. So this is something that's also written about. There's a lot written about it. So it's a great question and it can easily be discussed with your chair and also through the literature.
And I'm so glad you point that out through the literature piece, because it also, the second, there was a follow-up question to it. If you're using multiple groups, would that cause more issues with your research, or would it provide more accurate qualitative research? And again, as you had mentioned, working with your chair and the literature on that piece, and it's a
Yeah,
little bit of a skew from the data analysis
yeah,
part.
yeah.
But any other final thoughts on that piece before I move on?
No, but excellent questions and very
Mm,
important questions to think about as you're creating your qualitative sample. Those all are related to sampling, purposeful
yes.
sampling, and there are many different types of purposeful sampling, including maximum variation sampling. There's even convenience sampling, which is not the greatest way to go because it's just based on convenience. But there are, and I've written in my books about this, and many other authors have also written about the different ways of sampling, being purposeful sampling, but there are many different techniques that there are under purposeful sampling. And so these are very important questions to be discussing with your chair as you're setting up your study in your methodology section. And these are things to think about right from the beginning. So excellent questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg. Couple more things. One is about coding. Someone had mentioned with their first round of coding, they had 115 different codes. Is that normal? Was the
Oh, that's
question.
very normal. One, you can have like over 500 codes.
Yes.
It also depend in your first coding scheme, which is your initial take, you'd have a number, and I'm not going to put a number on it. When you redo it, you're going to have significantly more because you're going to be seeing more into your data. And this is why I really advocate for a manual approach of coding as opposed to qualitative software. But I'm not saying don't use the software. Both of them have benefits and disadvantages. But yes, you can have hundreds of codes, but also toward the end, you're going to be collapsing and categorizing your codes. And so you basically build it up and then you break it down into less codes that are manageable. So even though you get to a
Exactly.
very high number in your final rounds of your coding scheme, you're going to see that say, hey, these 5 codes actually say the same thing, and they become one code. So and I see Dr. Spranger nodding her head, and I'm sure she went through
Yes.
that in her own dissertation.
Oh my goodness, yes. And I remember being kind of overwhelmed by the amount of codes that I had. And then
Yeah.
I was kind of nodding my head too because of my own personal experience with in vivo, and kind of wishing that I went the manual route. So maybe in my next research endeavor, I will go the
Yeah.
manual route, but I had stuck to in vivo at the time. So This participant attendee said, "Thank you so much. It means they're not crazy." No, you are not crazy.
No,
You're doing a
no.
great job.
And the word that I use in my books and that I mentioned on an earlier slide, winnowing. Winnowing means narrowing down. So you build up all your codes to a huge amount of codes, and then you narrow it down so that you can actually create categories which become your themes. And I don't want to underestimate the intensity of thematic analysis. It's not just an easy once-off approach. All of the approaches that I'm talking about today, thematic analysis, qualitative content analysis, and IPA, are all extremely intensive approaches to qualitative data analysis.
One more thing, Dr.
Yes,
Bloomberg, before we
yes.
move on, on thematic analysis. This question did come up in the chat. It just says thematic analysis is recommended for case study designs. Could that work for narrative designs as well? And I thought it was applicative
Yes, it
to cover
absolutely
that.
can also work for narrative inquiry because narrative inquiry is really about participants' voices, their narratives. And so thematic analysis is definitely applicable to narrative inquiry as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg. That covers it for right now.
And also, just to say, it will also be applicable to ethnography because ethnography is based on culture, but also you're getting at people's voices. And so you're going to be doing interviews and maybe focus groups. And so, yes, thematic analysis applies there as well.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So now we're going to be moving on to the next method, which is qualitative content analysis, which applies, as I said earlier, to document review. It's a document analysis strategy where you're looking to analyze certain words or concepts. Sorry, I just have to move this out of the way. The researcher quantifies and analyzes. Now, the word quantify is a little misleading, and I'm going to be focusing on that in a moment because quantifying reminds us of quantitative research, right? But we are not just counting and quantifying, we're doing more than that in qualitative content analysis. And I'll explain that now in a moment. But we analyze the presence, meanings, and relationships of words or concepts and make inferences about the messages within the text. The focus is on the writer, in other words, who wrote that document, the author of the document. Remember, we're looking at documents now, not interview transcripts. We're looking at the audience for the document, the culture, and the time that that document was published or presented. So, in the first step in qualitative content analysis, the text is broken down into manageable categories on a variety of levels: words, word senses, phrases, sentences, or themes. And then, as a step two, we would have a closer examination using one of the content analysis basic methods as outlined by Vase Morady in 2013. And these two basic methods are conceptual analysis and relational analysis. So conceptual analysis establishes the existence and frequency of concepts, which are mostly words or phrases in the text, in the document. And relational analysis takes it one step further by examining the relationship among the concepts in the text. So one can do a conceptual analysis on its own, but one can also do the combination of conceptual analysis and then taking it to the next level, which is relational analysis, which is a much more in-depth approach to qualitative content analysis. Again, in the references for this webinar, all of the authors that I've cited are the full references are presented in the final slides. And so I urge you to take note of those references and to read further based on the way that you would like to take your own qualitative data analysis. So here is also a little bit more about qualitative content analysis, the inductive and the deductive tracks. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this now because I'm trying to be mindful of the time that we have. But to read more into it, please take a look at slide 20, which talks about the inductive approach to qualitative content analysis. And then page 21 is a deep dive into, or just actually not such a deep dive, a brief overview, and I'm going to spell this out now, of coding versus content analysis. So you may be saying to yourself, we spoke a few minutes ago about coding. How does this differ from content analysis? Well, counting codes conveys a quantitative frequency, which is, as I said a few minutes ago, contrary to qualitative research. In qualitative research, we are not using statistics and we are not really counting anything. Counting may provide a useful indicator for the importance of a given code if you're coding your data. But this also risks the possibility of overlooking significant or unique codes. So, in other words, if somebody said something once, this does not mean that you can overlook it because somebody else said something 7 times. This does not mean that the person that said the once off thing is not important. And this relates back to what I was talking about earlier with the unspoken or implicit codes. We cannot overlook things that are not said or even things that are said very, very minimally. Even something that is said once needs to be taken note of because it's important in its own right. And there might be a very significant reason for why it's only being said very few times or not at all. So Elliott in 2018 stated, if a researcher decides to count, it's essential that they also think carefully about how to use counts and what they imply for the later stages of data analysis. Again, if one is going to be doing a content analysis for qualitative data, I suggest reading Elliott 2018 as a very important text. Now, I'm just going to stop again before we move on to interpretive phenomenological analysis, which is our final method. And remember, as I said, it is only for phenomenological study. So just stopping here for a moment, Emily, if there are any questions about qualitative content analysis.
Nothing popped up in the chat about that at this time. And I don't see anything in the Q&A at this time either, Dr. Bloomberg.
Okay. Okay. No problem. Just remember that the qualitative content analysis is only for your document review. It's not going to be used for your interviews or focus groups or any other data collection method, only for documents. Now, moving on to interpretive phenomenological analysis, IPA, this applies only to phenomenology, and the method is not used with any other qualitative research designs. With this analytic method, the researcher explores how individuals' experiences make sense, how individuals' experience makes sense of their significant life events. So in other words, we are looking at a smaller sample than a case study, for instance, and we're trying to look at the lived experience of the participants. Many people make the error of using the word lived experiences with case study, narrative inquiry, and ethnography. This term really only applies to phenomenology. It's written about by Mistakis and some of the other seminal authors of phenomenology, and it really is a term that applies to phenomenology only. Now, in phenomenology and with IPA, we make use of in-depth qualitative analysis and researcher interpretation, and this method really requires a high degree of researcher skill and expertise, even more so than thematic analysis. There are many, many different aspects to IPA, including bracketing, which I haven't even discussed in this presentation, which is a method whereby the researcher brackets or puts aside their own biases through an interview that they do themselves. So IPA is a highly specialized technique, and if one is considering a phenomenological study, this method is something that really would need to be studied well so that you are sure that you're applying it correctly and appropriately and not in a watered down fashion. If this method is not applied correctly, again, it would really undermine the rigor and quality and credibility of this phenomenological study. So the focus is on participants' lived experiences. And the question is really asking what it's like for this person to experience that experience, whatever that experience is. For example, living with chronic pain, becoming a parent, failing an exam, or receiving a medical diagnosis. So we really, really honed into the person's lived experience. The researcher interprets the participant's account of their experience, but this is called double hermeneutics. Again, these are terms that one can read up on and would be essential to be familiar with if one is doing a phenomenological study. The participant is trying to make sense of their experience, and the researcher is trying to make sense of the participant making sense of it. This is what we call double hermeneutics. The analysis involves systematic, careful coding and theme development. So we still do coding and theme development, But we are seeking patterns within and across participants to achieve the essence of the common experience. This is where it diverges from thematic analysis, a broad thematic analysis that would be applied in a case study, narrative inquiry, or ethnography. We're looking at the essence of the shared or common experiences. And this is what takes phenomenology and RPA to another level. And this is why I say it requires quite a bit of skill and expertise. The key features of IPA is threefold. Idiographic, which means it's specifically focused. We work with small samples and we dive deeply into each individual's lived experience before looking for the shared or common themes of that experience. B, we look for rich, detailed data, which we get through in-depth, semi-structured interviews. The interviews are much, much more in-depth than, for example, a case study interview. And we can also incorporate diaries, letters, and other written narratives to corroborate or triangulate the information we get from the semi-structured, in-depth interviews. Remember, very often with case study, we would do a structured interview with some semi-structured prompts, but it would still be called a structured interview. In other words, everybody gets the same questions. With phenomenology, these are technically and typically semi-structured interviews where you have to follow along the participant's lived experience. And this may mean asking off-the-cuff questions that you hadn't thought of before you started the interview. So again, phenomenology is much more intensive and much more skill related than a case study design. And C is the deeply meaning-centered findings. We are seeking the meanings of thoughts, emotions, beliefs, and identity. So again, this is taking it to a much deeper level than we would be looking at in a case study, for instance, where we are looking at each individual's experience and then trying to determine the common themes among all of the participants' experiences. We're not looking for the core essence of the experience as we do in phenomenology. So RPA analysis, there are many steps to go through. We read the transcripts. We have an initial coding, which is descriptive, linguistic, and conceptual. We develop emergent themes. We connect the themes into significant clusters. We repeat the process for each participant, and we then look for the patterns across individuals to develop that shared or common essence of the experience. The strengths and limitations of IPA is that the strengths are that it's an exceptional, deeply and nuanced approach to data analysis. We get incredibly rich data when we are looking at that shared common experience. It's ideal for sensitive and emotional topics because it really takes those experiences to a very, very deep level. And we also capture the complexity of the meaning on many, many levels. The limitations are that it's time intensive, very time intensive. We use smaller samples typically, and that's not really a limitation, but it's something to be aware of. You can actually have 3 or 4 people in your sample, whereas for a case study, you'd need way more than that. Again, we're not going to be going so much into sampling now, but there are guidelines for each of the different research designs in qualitative analysis. It's less suitable, this is IPA, less suitable for policy or prevalence questions. And remember, Mustakis' 1994 transcendental approach provides a rigorous and systematic method for identifying significant statements, clustering those meaning units, and then synthesizing the essence of the participants' shared experiences. And Mustakis, 1994, is one of the seminal authors of phenomenology. I've listed his publication in the references. And that is something, a publication that needs to be read very, very closely if one is intending to do a phenomenological study. IPA versus thematic analysis. I'm not going to be going into the detail here, but please take a look at slide 27 when you receive this presentation to really do a deep dive into how does thematic analysis differ from IPA. I have covered all of this now in the presentation, but this slide just makes it very much clearer about the type of questions that are asked and the kind of data that you're really trying to get at. But the bottom line contrast is that thematic analysis is about patterns at the data set level, so patterns at the broad level. What is your entire sample telling you? What are the patterns? What are the themes? Whereas IPA is much more about the meaning at the individual level and how that meaning relates to the meaning of other participants to create what are called that common essence of experience. And these are terms that you would use specifically. So you would not use the word lived experiences if you're talking about a case study or a narrative inquiry or an ethnography. You'd only use that in phenomenology. And you also wouldn't talk about the essence of experiences in the other research designs. It applies specifically to phenomenology. Okay, I'm going to stop there for a moment before we go on to trustworthiness.
Yes, great. Thank you so much. Two questions that did pop up in the chat. Someone was asking a question about the mixture of thematic and content analysis. The question is, so would you use a mixture of thematic and content analysis if you're doing a multiple case study?
Even if you're doing a well, I'm not sure what the person really means by the multiple case study because we typically do single case studies for
Single case
dissertation.
study.
Yeah, a single
Mhm.
case study for dissertation research, even though you have many different people and there's a diverse group in your sample, that does not make it a multiple case study. Multiple case studies are used when you're comparing one complete case study with another case study. It's a comparative study. Most dissertation are not multiple case studies. Most of them are single. That said, in a single case study, yes, if you're doing document review as one of your data collection methods, in addition to interviews or focus groups, for the interviews or focus groups, you do a thematic analysis. For your documents, you do your qualitative content analysis. Remember, I said you cannot use thematic analysis as a method with documents. So if documents are one of your data collection methods, you would be using qualitative content analysis. That is the only way to analyze documents um, in the true sense, in a qualitative way.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg. And then the other question, this person does preface not sure if this question could be answered now or directly with the chair. So I'm just going to preface it with that. But because you mentioned methodological congruence, how can you maintain methodological congruence across chapter 2, 3, and 4 to ensure that the theoretical framework, design, and analysis remain aligned? So this is looking at alignment,
Yeah, I
which may be a
think that
conversation for.
question, I'm not 100% sure how I can answer that as it
Okay, that's
relates
fair.
to data analysis, but that is a question. If that's on somebody's mind, please ask that specific question to your chair. I'm not really sure what you're asking, but methodological congruence typically means, and again, I've written about this extensively in my publications, it means that you're keeping a design specific approach. In other words, if you choose case study, you're doing an analysis that is aligned with case study and you're presenting your findings the way a case study asks to present findings. So, and if you're doing phenomenology, you're doing the same thing. You're doing IPA and you're presenting findings in a phenomenological manner. So methodological congruence, whatever qualitative research design you're choosing, you have to be true to that design. And that will establish methodological congruence. And this goes right through your dissertation, not really the literature review, but the entire design of your study, the way you sample, the way you code, the way you present your findings, all have to be aligned with that research design.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg. And just one more point, just because this is a recorded session and not to confuse certain students, but there are different ways that your dissertation is developed, and some are a chapter
Right.
route and another is a
Yes.
section route. So just wanted to make sure we caught that on recording, just in case.
Yes. Thanks for catching that. I just want to reiterate, and you're absolutely right, is that with our PhD programs, we still do a 5-chapter dissertation. With our EDDs, we do a 3-section dissertation. They're both very different in approach. They both are very different in structure.
Mm,
And so you would use a different template for each one of the two. And these are things that you would become familiar with right at the very beginning of your dissertation sequence. You'd be given the correct template and you would know what is expected with all the regulations and the recommendations and the requirements for each specific chapter or section.
wonderful. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
So when I say chapter, I mean chapter
Yes.
or section. Not all
Correct, correct.
universities, yeah, and thanks for bringing that. Not all universities use a three-section dissertation. Many universities use chapters. But you're
Correct.
absolutely correct. At NU, we have the two different formats based on the two different pathways for
Yes.
doctoral research.
Base, yes, and that is similar situation if you are because Dr. Bloomberg is referencing something from the School of Education, but if you're in the School of Business per se, again, there could be a section dissertation or a chaptered dissertation, just
Exactly.
for example.
Yes. Thank you so
Um,
much for your keen eye and attention to that detail. It's very important.
just wanted to
Um,
make sure so someone didn't hear it in the
Yes,
recording later and like,
absolutely.
I'm
And
not doing
this
chapters.
was this was a university-wide webinar, so absolutely. The different schools have different templates
Yes,
and different program pathways. So depending on your program pathway, you would be doing chapters or sections.
wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg. And I know we have about 7 minutes left, so I'm going to turn it back over to you, and then we'll see if there's any other
Yeah.
additional questions.
Okay, great. So, because we are a little pressed for time, I'm not going to go into all the details of trustworthiness because each of the trustworthiness, so go back to that previous slide, each of these trustworthiness criteria being credibility, confirmability, dependability, and transferability, each one of them has different strategies associated with it to make sure that you're addressing that criterion. And again, this is on slide 30 where all the details are laid out in a very brief manner, but the books that I list in the references deal with this issue to a much more extensive extent. And then I just want to come back and finish off with this idea of the human touch, which I started off with in the beginning, that despite advances in AI, despite technological advancements, only a human can actually interpret something. A machine cannot. Obviously, machines can try, but there are many flaws and hallucinations that one need to be aware of. And as I said, many prominent qualitative researchers at this point, even though AI is widely adopted in many formats and in many ways, and can be extremely beneficial and useful for many different types of purposes, as yet, it is not highly recommended for qualitative data analysis. And as I write, and many others, I've listed them all here along with me: Christou, Davison, Friedman, Jowsey, Nick Manus, and Spurrier. And actually, Jowsey et al. Incorporates, and I'm sure many people are using, sorry, what are the two authors who write about thematic analysis? They're very prominent authors. I just can't think of their names right now, but they themselves also don't advocate AI for qualitative data analysis. Oh, Braun and Clark. Many of us are very familiar with all of their publications, and even they are not recommending AI for qualitative data analysis. So please be aware of the human touch and just make sure that your qualitative data analysis is very firmly grounded in your own human interpretation. Um, Again, on page 32, this is what I've taken from the literature. These are some of the caveats associated with AI when it comes to data analysis in qualitative research, and you can read more about it on slide 32, and I also write about it on slide 33. So before we stop for a few broad general questions, and I know we only have about 5 minutes left, I just want to make sure that it's evident that all the work that I've based this webinar on is from these two publications and also my latest publication, which is going to be sent out with this webinar. And I promised Emily that it would be completed by the time I conducted the webinar, and it was published just 3 days ago. And this is an open access research on qualitative data analysis, processes, strategies, and application to dissertation research. All of the information in this publication is taken from my two books, Completing Your Qualitative Dissertation and 101 Golden Nuggets for Preparing a Qualitative Dissertation. That said, I'm just going to show you where all the references are listed. There are 2 pages of references, and I hope that you find these useful as you delve into this very important topic of qualitative design specific analysis. And I'm going to take some final questions.
I have to giggle just a little bit, Dr. Bloomberg, that you got it published 3 days before.
I know. I promised you, and I did it.
You did. I mean, first of all,
I
congratulations.
remember you saying to me, what is this? And I said, I'm working on it, but it will be ready. Didn't I say
Yes,
that?
that is exactly what happened. I was like, so is everyone going to have access to this? She was like, yes, it's going to be published before, like, get right up against
Yep. It was
the,
published on Monday, actually,
oh my
and on
goodness.
Friday last week.
Well, congratulations. And I do have to check out the 101 nuggets, but I lived in your other complete
Yeah. Yeah.
road.
I just have to say with 101 nuggets, and I'm just putting it back on the slide, there are 101 questions that pertain to a qualitative dissertation. So each of the 101 is a mini essay on that question. And the book is being widely used now internationally, and it is useful. So I hope people do find it useful. It's available through Sage or Amazon, as all the other books are.
Well, I certainly lived in completing your qualitative dissertation. I was just in it.
Well, I'm
So
actually just busy on the sixth edition. I have a contract with Sage to do the sixth edition now.
wonderful, wonderful. Well, it's a wealth of resource for our students, especially for our qualitative researchers in the
Yeah.
room. Let
So
me see.
Emily, are there any final questions that I can address before we hop off? And
You
thank you
know,
for your kind words about my book. I appreciate it.
oh, of course. Just a couple of people saying thank you so much. It was very helpful. Information, also the book, very helpful. Let's see, any other things that would be kind of final thoughts before we close out? Oh, just some thank yous, Dr.
Okay.
Bloomberg.
I would just
So,
like to say one final thought, if I
mm,
can, in closing
yes,
out. Firstly,
of
thank you
course.
to you, Dr. Spranger, for hosting these and for always being such a wonderful host,
Thank you.
and for welcoming these topics so that our students and faculty can learn from them. Also want to thank all the participants who were on this call. I greatly appreciate all of your time and participation. And finally, I want to say, which is what Dr. Spranger said at the very beginning, please use your dissertation chair as your main important go-to. Your chair is there to guide you from beginning to end. And so you will not be alone in your dissertation and research process. Your chair and even your subject matter expert are your committee who will be there to help you move forward and to finally complete your research and present the dissertation. So, ask them all the questions you have, share with them any concerns you have, and learn from them because they've already done this and they have been through the process multiple times with other students. So they are here to support you.
Absolutely. Dr. Bloomberg, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for all of our attendees. And until the next time, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. You take care.
Thank you. Bye bye. Thank you.
Bye bye.